Hey everyone, I'm Runa and welcome back to my Intro to Sewing video series. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I highly recommend you go back and check that out. It covers some sewing terms that are really important for getting started, and I'll reference a lot of them in this video, so I'll link that below. This is part 2 where we'll talk a bit more about getting started with sewing, like how to choose a pattern, a material, all that. I'll get more hands-on and show you some stitching and seams to give you an idea of what those look like. And just a reminder that, like part 1, this is recorded from my live stream over on Twitch. So that's why it's formatted the way it is in some places, just as a heads up. With all that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so now we've gotten through the terms. We've gotten through some of the materials that you might need to get started. Now I'm getting to the actual tips for getting started. So some general tips for getting started. Start by practicing your stitches on some scrap fabric. The hardest part, I think, when you're first starting with the sewing machine particularly, is just getting used to maneuvering the fabric through the machine. And it feels kind of scary when you press on the foot and it goes super fast, it goes starts to stitch, and you have to kind of maneuver the fabric and then also manage pressing on the foot, and it's just a lot going on. So just get some cheap fabric or, thrift some fabric like bed sheets or whatever and cut it all up and just practice stitching. Practice doing some seams, practice your different stitches on your machine, play around with it, just get a feel for it. It's really tempting to start that big project right away. And a lot of people get into sewing because they have a specific project in mind, but it really helps to keep it simple when you're starting out and just do some practice projects so that you're not wasting materials and wasting time when you don't really have the skills to complete that bigger project yet. One thing you will often see in tutorials and that you always want to remember is right sides together. So we talked about the right and the wrong side of the fabric earlier. But basically, when you're sewing two pieces together, you essentially sew a garment inside out. So you put the right side of both your pieces together and sew it, and that way when you flip it right side out, the seams will be on the inside, and they won't show on the outside. So you don't want any visible seams on the outside of the garment. Just a couple ideas for some starter projects that are pretty simple. Pillowcases, baby blankets or lap blankets. I've made baby blankets and stuff in the past by basically you just get a square of fabric and then you hem it on all sides and it's a blanket. Congrats, so that can be nice. Circle skirt is one that is suggested a lot because it's fairly easy to pattern. You basically just cut a circle and then you cut out a circle for your waist, and then you can attach elastic or whatever to make it a skirt, and then you just hem it, and it's pretty simple. The only tricky thing about a circle skirt is that it's harder to hem a curve, so you may want to practice doing a couple straight hems before you do that. And generally when you're hemming a curve, you just want to keep it as narrow as possible so that it doesn't get all bunched up. Okay, so pretty much for every pattern, whether you're drafting your own pattern, which I didn't say this before, but drafting is basically where you draw out your own pattern based on measurements versus using a commercial one. But even if you're using a commercial one, it'll have a size guide similar to like clothing. And you want to be able to take your measurements and to figure out the right size that you need. So always take your measurements with a tailor's or sewing tape measure, something soft and flexible, not, like a metal contractor one. So yeah, you always want to use a soft tape measure. If you don't have one, you can use like a piece of string or something and then measure that with like a metal tape measure. But I've seen even in grocery stores, like a basic sewing kit that comes with a tape measure. They're not expensive. Like every sewing kit you ever buy will come with a tape measure. So I have like 20 of them by now. So just go ahead and get one. Your pattern will tell you which measurements to take. To tell the size. Most often that's your bust and waist. Sometimes you'll have like a length involved. Sometimes it's based on height. It really depends. For women, it's usually the bust and the waist. For men, it's sometimes called the chest and the waist. And when they say waist, that means your natural waist, which is the point around your belly button, essentially. Hi guys, editing pasta here, so I actually misspoke in that clip that we just saw. So the natural waist is actually not at your belly button. It's actually a point between your belly button and your ribs, and that is basically where your body kind of naturally creases when you bend side to side. But effectively, if the point of your body at the belly button is wider, we still have to account for that when it comes to fit. So typically, you just take the bigger of the two measurements depending on what you're making. Now, if you're a man or if you're even just a woman who wears your pants at your hips, sometimes you may want to substitute the hip measurement, which is where your hip bones actually are, for your waist measurement when you're dealing with pants specifically. But for something like a dress, it's more often the natural waist. And then when you're taking measurements, you want the tape measure to be snug, but not too tight. You're not trying to like cut into your stomach or whatever while you're measuring it. And if you're doing your chest or something, like I usually breathe in fully when I take the measurement because you want it to fit, you want to be able to breathe in your clothing. Sometimes it helps to have someone else help you take your measurements just to make sure you're getting in the right position. Especially with sleeves, like if you're going to have a long sleeve shirt, you need to measure the length of your arm to get the sleeve the correct length. So sometimes it's a little tricky to do on your own, so it helps to have someone else help you. On the little models here, you can also see it's labeled inseam, which is basically the inside of your leg from about the crotch to the ankle. Men's pants are often sized by the inseam. So if you wear, if you're a man who wears pants in something other than just small, medium, or large, you may already know your inseam length. And that'll come up a lot in sewing and patterns. You may also run into your outseam or your upper and lower leg, depending on the pattern, depending on what it is. And also like shorts, for example, aren't going to be the full length of your leg. So it's just kind of however long you want the shorts to be. Okay, so choosing a pattern or a style. So another tricky thing when you're first starting out sewing is you look at a dress or whatever, you look at an item and you're like, wow, I want to make that. That's so cool. But you don't know what it's called. So just searching for dress pattern, well, there's a million styles of dresses, like what type of dress. So if you Google like types of dresses or types of whatever or styles, you'll come up with some diagrams like this that'll show you what the different styles are called, what the different like waistlines are called and stuff like that. So then you can use those keywords to look for patterns. Or if you go physically to a store like your fabric store, there will be just patterns and you can just kind of look at the pictures and pick one. And then maybe kind of as you make a couple of those, remember the keywords that were used in the names of those patterns to help you look for similar ones. Again, you want to keep it fairly simple when you're starting out, so don't try to make something don't make a ball gown for your first project. That's not a good idea. So the more simple the style, the easier it is to make. And also, like I talked about with fabric, working with less stretchy fabrics to start off can help because stretchy fabrics can be a little tricky to sew. All right, so now we're getting into the portion where it is some examples of stitches and seams and how to do a few seams. So in the presentation, I've got pictures of this, but I'm just going to turn on the webcam and show you. So bear with me 1 second while I swap scenes here. So I've got my little sample piece of fabric here, if I can get it. So this is my little sample piece that I did. I'm showing different lengths. So these are straight stitches at the top, and you can kind of see if it'll focus. There's a bit of a difference between putting the length really long. You can just see the stitches are more spaced out, versus you can make them really short and have really tight stitches, or you can just kind of leave it on the average or the default. Usually if there's a number for your length on your stitches, it'll just be whatever's in the middle is kind of the default. That's what I use for most things. There's really not much reason to mix it up with a straight stitch unless you're specifically trying to do basting stitches, in which case you would do the longest length. When you get to zigzag, it's a bit more obvious. So you've got kind of the standard or whatever the default is, where it's pretty even. Versus if you keep the width the same, but increase the length, it'll be more spaced out like that. Or you can get just a bigger stitch overall by doing a longer length and width. Or it's not shown here, but essentially you can adjust either. So you could have a shorter length, but a longer width, etc., etc. Just kind of play around with it on your machine, depending on what you're doing. When I'm finishing edges, if I use a zigzag, I tend to go for the widest width because I want to cover as much of the fabric as possible. Let me show you. I've got my little samples here. Hold on. Get to my... Okay, so here's my little sample piece of fabric that I've sewn together. This is a standard seam. So basically, I've just taken a straight stitch, taken my two pieces, and sewed down along. This is the wrong side, or the inside of the fabric. So then when you unfold it, we've got a nice seam. You can't see the stitching, and the right side is on the outside. So the right sides are sandwiched together, do the stitching, and then that's a seam. Now this is an unfinished seam, and you can see it's already starting to fray, and it will fray out over time. This is linen, which is especially prone to fraying sometimes. So you want to finish your seam by doing something on the edge of it. So this is just a standard zigzag, and I've kind of let the zigzag go over the edge of it. Now you can see there's still a little bit of fray, but essentially it's secured, and these threads are going to eventually fall off, and then it won't go any further. So your seam's not going to fall apart when you've got a finished seam. So again, this is now the wrong side, or the inside of the garment. And then we've got our right sides, or our outside of our garment. And you'll see the seam, but you won't see any stitching. Now, there's different methods of seaming. So one that is very strong, and you'll often see it on things like jeans, is a flat felled seam. So essentially, a flat felled seam starts out normal. You do right sides together, do your seam. The only difference is you want to use a larger seam allowance, so leave some extra space here. And then you're gonna trim down one edge of the seam allowance. So one side, you're going to trim that down so that it's shorter than the other side. You can see I've done this to this piece here. And then what you're going to do, it helps to kind of press this open with an iron. You're going to take the longer side of the seam allowance and fold it under the shorter side, or fold it over the shorter side, sorry, and then fold it down so that all the raw edges are completely encased in that folded edge. So you can fold it all the way down your seam, and you can either press it down with an iron or pin it in place like this so it stays. And then the next step is you're going to sew along that folded edge. So basically all the raw edges are completely encased here, and this makes for a very sturdy seam. So in this case, I used a contrasting color so you guys can see it, obviously, but in this case for a flat felled seam, the stitching is going to show to the other side of the fabric. So you want to use a matching color thread so that it's not as obvious. And it's going to be very flat and smooth. So a flat felled seam is very sturdy, but it's also flat. It's not as bulky. So that's why they use it for things like denim and thicker fabrics where you want that sturdiness, but you don't want too much bulk. Another type of seam is a French seam, which French seams are effectively sewed backwards. So they can be a bit confusing because it's the reverse of what you would normally do. So instead of putting the right sides together, so then you flip it and then it's on the inside, you put the wrong sides together first. So this would be the right side of the fabric, the patterned side, and then you sew it like that, basically inside out. And you want to either use a very narrow seam allowance or go back in and trim down the seam allowance afterwards. And then what you're going to do is essentially flip it inside out. So flip it back and press this seam open so that it's not too bunched up here. And then now this becomes the inside, and you're going to sew along this again. So I've got one where I flipped it around and I've sewn again, basically encasing that entire raw edge inside this seam. And then on the outside, it looks like a normal seam and you don't have anything showing through. So this is really good for ear fabrics where you don't want the raw edges to be visible because they can kind of show through. Or fabrics that are just really prone to fraying, that are just nightmare to work with. Sometimes a French seam, or sometimes it's called an encased seam, is the best bet because it's entirely encased. You don't have to worry about that fraying at all. And while that is also the case with the flat felled, some fabrics, they don't want to fold quite as nicely and tuck under like that. So a French seam is easier. So those are the types of seams. There's other types of seams. You can also completely bind your seam in bias tape or bias binding. And that's technically called like a Hong Kong seam, I think, or a bound seam. I don't know. That's a little excessive. I don't usually do that. But that's an option. You can do basically any of these by hand. You would just replace the straight stitch on your machine with a straight hand stitch. The only thing with a flat felled seam by hand, you don't necessarily just do a straight stitch here. You can actually kind of catch just the edge of it and kind of loop around and go up. And it's called like a hand felled seam. And there's a lot of videos on how to do specific types of seams, but you kind of have to know what they're called, and so that you can search for that to start with. Yeah, I'm not going to do a deep dive on this is how you do different types of seams. It's more just here's the basic overview, here's what it looks like, so you know how to Google it later. The same thing with a zigzag. If you were hand doing this, you could do a whip stitch, which is basically you would take your needle and go around the thread. You would basically loop the thread around the edge so that it encases that raw edge. And there's some great videos out there about hand sewing techniques if you're really specifically into that. I don't do a ton of hand sewing, so I'm not the expert on that, but I do know some basic stuff. I highly recommend Bernadette Banner's YouTube channel if you want some hand sewing tips. So lastly, I'm going to show you guys how to hem a piece of fabric. So say this is the bottom of your garment, right? You need to finish off this raw edge and hem it. So the most common hem that you're going to see is a rolled hem or a double fold hem. So basically, you're going to start off by pressing, just folding the corner or folding the edge of the fabric towards the inside and pressing it down, either just kind of pressing it with your hands like I'm doing, or you can use an iron. Sometimes an iron really helps here. And then essentially, we're going to just fold it again. So you're going to take that edge you just folded and fold it up again. It doesn't have to be an exact amount, roughly a 1/4 inch fold each time is good, but it doesn't have to be super precise. The narrower you do the hem, the easier it is to do on a curve. So obviously on a straight piece of fabric, it's going to be easiest. But if you keep it narrow, you can kind of get it to work on a curve. Or if it's just too annoying to do on a curve, that's where a facing is good, because you can just cut your facing on the curve as well, match the hemline, and then do that. So now it's folded over, and you can either take a pin, these are sewing, well, this one's not straight, I bent it, but straight sewing pins, usually they have some kind of head on them so they don't slip through. Or you can use clips. So I've got these little sewing clips that I really like to use for things like hems because they just, they don't mark the fabric. Certain fabrics will show needle marks if you put a pin through them. Usually that's more for silks and satins and fancy stuff, but I just kind of think these clips are easier to deal with sometimes. So if you look for these, I think you can find them on Amazon. They're sewing clips or something. And basically you could just clip that rolled edge so that it stays in place as you're doing it or as you're sewing it. And then we're just going to sew down that folded edge. And I've just got a straight stitch on here right now. So I'm going to sew down. Now this is where you could also use a decorative stitch and it could be really pretty. That's a great way to kind of add a little bit of pizzazz to a fairly simple project. You could use a decorative stitch for your hemming. So you've got two pieces of thread, right? So you've got the one coming down from the bottom through your needle, and then the one coming up from the bobbin. And your machine manual will tell you how to thread your machine, how to do all that. There's different types of foots or feet for your sewing machine. This is the foot. There's a lot of really specific ones for really specific purposes, like there's a zipper foot or there's one that will even hem for you. It's a rolled hem foot. There's all kinds of ones, but usually your machine will just come with a few basic ones. I like this one with kind of a clear piece in the front because it's good for when I'm doing my applique and decorative stitching. I can kind of see where the stitches are going, but it's really whatever your machine comes with is probably fine. But one thing I struggled with a lot was the top thread has a tendency to kind of want to pull out when you first start sewing, because when you pull the needle down or when it just kind of tugs on that thread and it wants to slip out, and you'll start sewing and then you'll realize you're not actually sewing because you didn't have the thread in there, and it's really annoying. So when you first start, try to hold that. You don't have to hold it tightly, but just kind of don't let it slip through just until you get the first couple stitches done, and then it'll be fine. So just kind of pull the clips out as you're going, or if you have pins, you can just pull them out and put them on your pin cushion, or sometimes there's like magnetic holder things that are nice. So if you've ironed it, you may not need the clips or pins, but I didn't really iron it properly. I didn't want to go get my iron, so I just used the clips. And then basically, yeah, you just sew a straight stitch down along the hem and clip it off. And then, so this would be the inside where you can see the edge. And I tend to kind of get as close as I can to that folded edge so it doesn't like flip up later, and wrinkle and be weird. And then on the other side, it looks like that. And if you've used a matching colored thread, it'll just kind of blend in. You won't really be able to see it. Or if you want to specifically make it stand out, you can use a contrasting color and kind of make it pop, or use a decorative stitch. So that's how to do a basic hem. Alright guys, thanks so much for watching. That was part 2 of the Intro to Sewing, or Things I Wish I Knew When I Started Sewing video series. Part 3 will come out soon, and we'll talk a bit more about sewing machines specifically and how they work. So I'm excited for that, and I hope you'll join me again. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.